Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and a very warm welcome to distinguished guests, friends, and members of the public for today's book launch, Social Protection, Lands of Blossoming Hope by Usha Mishra Hayes, who is the Chief of the Social Policy in the United Nations in Nepal. That will be followed by a panel discussion on the theme From Practice to Policy and Lessons for Policy Influencing for Stronger COVID Response. I thank the organizers for inviting me to co-chair this book launch. I'm Sanjukta Ghosh from the SOAS South Asia Institute. I also want to invite the chair very soon. But before I do that, I want to briefly introduce the author, Usha Mishra Hayes, who is going to be interviewed in this session as well. We will hear a little bit about her long career, or rather a journey as a development expert with the United Nations in some of the most impoverished and challenging lands in Asia and Africa. With a master's degree in modern history from JNU, she joined the UN team quite early to work in Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Cambodia, Tanzania, Afghanistan, and currently in Nepal. The country profiles kind of follows the order in the book's chapters, and let's hope there will be more coming from her for other country reports as well. So I would like to ask Dr. Hussein Zillur Rahman, the chairperson of BRAC, to join us at this point and introduce the book slightly. Thank you. Zillur?
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to join this session. The book by Usha Mishra Hayes. It's a book with a difference because we are now talking not just about social protection policies, but about how to make sure that these policies create the right type of impacts and how the policy process can be influenced to pursue those more meaningful impacts. So congratulations to Usha Mishra Hayes for really choosing a type of focus which is not usually found in these academic publications. So as we know, the pandemic period has really, it's not just a health crisis, it's an enormously wide economic crisis too, which has put social protection at the very heart of the COVID response across countries, across the world as a whole. And getting our focus right, the priorities, the policy issues right, and the policy designs right are more important as never before. And therefore, I think the lessons from this book about how does one influence the policy process as a whole is critically important. I think one new dimension introduced into the academic discourse by the book is to really unpack the policy process itself, not just think of policy as just one document, but think of it as a process where issues are prioritized, designs are made, and the practicalities of implementation are indicated. So I think that's also a very important issue. The book has delved into many issues, but we have identified three critical insights from the book to take a closer look in this session. One is the fact that the COVID-19, as other crises before, are also moments of opportunities. So how does one translate crisis into opportunities and really engineer policy shifts in policy mindsets? For that, we will have Abdul Alim, the regional head of social policy of UNICEF, will be discussing on that. And we have another distinguished discussant, Professor Michael Sampson. He is the research director of the Economic Policy Research Institute of South Africa, he would be looking at the issue that Usha's book has really brought out again, which is that to gain traction, we need national champions or champions to drive that policy process. Michael Sampson will be focusing on that. And finally, it is also very critical that there is credible evidence to ensure the policy buy-in by the decision makers. And on that point, we have Subir Sinha, Senior Lecturer of Institutions and Development from SOAS, London. Having said that, we will now move to a interview with the author. Sanjukta, if you'd like to introduce Pedro on that.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Pedro here at this point, who would like to interview Usha, but I'll add a few lines as to where I find the book matters to me most as well. And I just feel the immediate relevance of the book is, of course, the pandemic, as you mentioned, and how a strong COVID response, both from governments, international donors, and civil society agencies, will map the future of the most vulnerable sections in society faced with the want of any kind of social protection, which we will hear today is obviously the new frontier in development discourse and international aid. I also wanted to highlight that, the book kind of coincides with the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize that was awarded to the UN's World Food Programme for its efforts to combat hunger and food security. And that to me struck also, being a historian on agricultural knowledge, as foregrounding the discussion on social protection, which is not just on poverty, but specifically on food entitlement through the remarkable beginnings of the World Food Programme. And throughout the book, I felt there was a lot of mention of this area and how it continued to influence the workings of the INGOs, the international government organizations, non-government organizations. And the program therefore also helped to shape the paradigm of a rights-based campaign, moving away from the standard relief-based food distribution programs in search of more long-term sustainable solutions. So the World Food Programme is one of the pillars in forming the UN Sustainable Development Goal to meet the country's specific crisis that is triggered by disaster management and resulting from hunger. So this obviously, as you said, brought also us to the three core recurring themes in the book that you've already raised. And I believe that these themes will also recur in the interview that Usha will be now joining us for, with Pedro Arruda, Senior Researcher with International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth. So I hand over to you, Pedro, to do the interview. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjukta. Thank you, colleagues from across the world watching us today. Namaste, Usha. Congratulations for the book. And thank you for cherishing us with this very interesting book and for availing yourself to give us some of the author's perspective on today's book launch. For the colleagues attending this webinar, please make sure to get your copy of her book. It's called Social Protection, Lens of Blossoming Hope. It's published by Palimpsest. And since last week, we can buy the ebook format via Amazon. I had the privilege to read the book already, and from one development practitioner to another, it is a very interesting book. And it excels at both, being a phenomenological account of Usha's very personal experiences ahead of social protection agendas, but it's also an important reflection on do's and don'ts for promoting social protection in developing countries. Interestingly, the book has no institutional linkages to any organizations where Usha has worked. And in that sense, it's a book that speaks with more freedom and passion about development issues than what we're often exposed to in the gray literature that is part of everybody's day-to-day. Without further ado, I would like to start with the first question to Usha, in which Basically, I would like you, Usha, to briefly tell us a bit about yourself, academic background, life trajectories. What was the path that took you to become an international servant? And more specifically, what have been your institutional positions ahead of social protection agendas in the 6 countries that you describe in your book?
Thank you, Pedro. Thanks for this opportunity to kind of interact with you and through you with the distinguished panel and all my friends and colleagues and other members of the audience. So it's indeed a very important day for me because obviously it's launch of the book, but also I'll get an opportunity to talk about issues which are close to my heart. So in terms of journey, it's that's a very interesting question because I believe that we take multiple journeys at the same time. So I don't know whether you want to know my about my journey as a daughter, as a mother, as a student, as a professional. And each of these could have different layers to it, and each of these could obviously take hours and hours. But to the pointed questions that you asked about academics, let me just start from there. I think my story of academics, I would say, is pretty much story of an Indian girl who was born in a middle class, and she obviously is made to value education because that's the way out for her. So that's her weapon, that's her opportunity to combat many challenges which are there in the Indian society, and they are still relevant today, whether it is caste or it is position of women, girl child, and as she sees that playing out in the position of mother in the family or the elder sisters and all that, and she sees all that and she realizes, oh God, okay, I need to overcome all this, and the best thing that I have is education. So that is what education was for me. It was a weapon for freedom to start with, and also there were other perks. If I got good grades, my father will pat me on my back, my mother will be exceptionally happy, she will have tears in her eyes. So all that stuff, and there is always a bit of egoistic self about it. You get good grades, you get pats from the teacher, so there is the ego factor was definitely there, so I was very committed to my studies. So the beginning was quite easy and interesting, but it became dramatic later on as I grew up. So there was expectation from the society and the family that I should be getting married first at the age of 18, and then certainly by the age of 22, and certainly by the time I had done my undergrad. So it's quite a miracle that I went on to finish my post grad from JNU, which was seen as a center of hippie culture. So my father was very reluctant about sending me to JNU. And that ensued a whole lot of drama, which is probably a different story, and I can talk later and perhaps at a different occasion or a different event. But yes, throughout my journey, my family, especially my sisters, were a big help to me. And they kind of formed a shield around me, which helped me concentrate on my studies. I think I was very fortunate in kind of choosing the right subjects. I studied economics. English literature was a passion. By the time I was 13, I had read the entire library of my dad. It was not a huge library, but there were two shelves, and a lot of those books were not really fit for 13-year-old. And my dad later on said, by the way, you shouldn't be reading that book. Too late. um, and then I went on to do my postgrad um, from JNU, history, but very strong influence of economics, post-colonialism, communism, capitalism, all that was very helpful to the international development work that I'm doing. Now, in terms of my journey as an international civil servant, I'll be honest, I'll tell you that I never envisioned that I'll end up in the UN. And what I always knew that I would like to do community development. I would like to go and see, and travel villages and towns and see whether the projects which were supposed to be designed and implemented, whether they were on track, whether people were benefiting from it. So the spirit of international development was something that I always found inspiring, and something that I had seen my dad do through his bureaucratic job in India. But I had never in my life imagined that I'll be in the UN. All that I wanted to do was to have some good amount of influence, for some good amount of work. How did I land with the UN? I guess it's a kind of a potluck, and I'm sorry if people are disappointed when they hear that, because there is not really a straightforward path to it. Also, because the UN doesn't really take freshers. There are not many fresh entry points. You kind of slog in NGOs and other places, and then kind of wait for opportunities to come up. And if you're lucky and you have some kind of matching skill set, you kind of you fit in, and you are in. I always say that many are called and few are selected. That's what the UN is. But what I can say is that UN is certainly the place where I would love to continue to be. It just is the right organization for me because it allows me to do development, and that also in partnership with the national governments. So it allows me to influence policies and all the work that are very close to my heart. I can wear my thinking hat, but at the same time, I can also be a person of action because that's where your management role comes in. So that's my journey in a nutshell, Pedro.
Wow, Usha, thank you. That was a very inspiring answer. Thank you very much. Another question I was hoping to put to you is that what were your motivations to write this book? And that's a short but tricky one. If you had to summarize this book in one sentence, what would the sentence be?
Okay, again, see, there's several motivations for any challenging task that we take. Obviously, the motivation was that I wanted to write a book, and because writing book is something seen as very challenging, so challenges kind of inspire me. And writing runs in my family, so my father has written hundreds of books, so I thought it was high time I wrote something. But as such, I had been writing, it's just that I hadn't written a book. So as a student, I was editor of my school magazine, and then I continued to write in various forms. I kind of wrote a novel when I was 21. It's still to be published. I hope it gets out. Now, in terms of making time for writing kind of a semi-technical book like the one that we are discussing today, I had some time when I was out of UNICEF. I had left UNICEF in 2016 and I was out for 2 years. And I was doing various sorts of consultancies around the world. And I moved from one country to the other, and I felt that I was able to translate experiences from one country when I went into the next, as well as pick up new nuances and new insights. And I felt that there are not many books which actually talk about the policy processes and what actually happens when you're thrown into that cauldron, in a national cauldron. What exactly happens? How do you figure out what you should be doing, what you should be pressing, what kind of initiatives you should be shaping up? So the motivation was the fact that I felt I had something to say. And I do believe that each one of us have unique perspective, so they experience the same situation from a very, very unique angle. And so I felt that my story would be unique, the way I would recount things would be unique. And I did kind of assess, I think, justifiably, that I had been able to achieve certain successes in these countries that I had worked. And I had more my own assessment of what the factors of the success were. And I wanted to share that. So the great motivation was that I felt I had something to say. And then the challenge of getting this book out, I guess I would kind of summarize there. In terms of one liner, um, it's really I would say it's an act of faith. And I would kind of rephrase it and say that it's kind of an effort of keeping the faith alive. Because even as the title suggests, it's lands of blossoming hope. There's a lot of cynicism around development in general, just not international development, right? And you can obviously throw data at people and say that, hang on, this hasn't worked. The cost benefit analysis is negative. You can do that as well. But I, through my career in the UN and before that with British government and Oxfam GB, I realized that we may not always be able to do what we set out for. So we may aim for, say, the stars, but we might end up at least getting the moon, So it's keeping the faith. And I think it's very important for us, for international civil servants, and for those working in international development or national development, not to be cynical and to keep the faith alive.
Wow.
Pedro, I hope you answered your question.
No, very, very wise words. And having read the book, this context and this inputs really like put a lot of things into perspective and make the whole experience of learning the book all the more enriching. Thank you very much. Another question I would like to ask you has to do, with the fact that in the book you narrate your experience ahead of social protection agendas in 6 different countries. One of them was India, your home country. But in all the other 5 countries, you were acting as an expat, So what do you think are the main advantages and disadvantages of doing advocacy as an international organization or as an expat, as opposed to doing advocacy for social protection as part of a national institution or, acting as a citizen as such, rather than an expat? Over.
Yeah, so I'm probably going to start with disadvantages first and then maybe end up on a more cheerful note of advantages. So there are a number of disadvantages, right? We basically are thrown from one country into the next without much of a gap, right? You're basically, as senior staff, you're supposed to hit the ground running. We don't necessarily get enough time to read up on the country to which we are posted. So you arrive in a country, you have to quickly orient yourself, get over all the administrative hassle, and then obviously start meeting the government, managing your team, participating in the senior management teams where you have to sound very smart and wise and all that stuff. So the biggest challenge right in the beginning is to really tell yourself that you're new and you want to understand things. To pace yourself is very, very important. And obviously you are not necessarily given that opportunity, right? So because you're taking decisions also on budget formulation, on partnership and everything else, so sometimes one can end up with wrong alliances, with wrong investments. So that's a big disadvantage, that you are the context is new, you are new, and however you might read about a country in a book or through magazines or through reports, it's never the same as being in the country and actually being able to talk to people. So that's something. Um, the second disadvantage is that you always have to be politically correct. You always have to be diplomatic. You always have to be mincing words and kind of looking over your shoulders. What can I say? What I can't say. And you're not only sensitive about the host government sensibilities, but also your national staff. So you are kind of, sometimes you feel that, is this real you? How much real you is really there? So you kind of, and sometimes this can lead to a bit of a stress when you find that there's too much of dichotomy between what you believe, what you see, what you would like to speak, and what you're able to speak, right? So these are the two big disadvantages. I'm sure there are lots many more, apart from the fact that you're out of your country. You are in a distant land. You don't really have much of social capital. You've been uprooted. You're establishing roots all over again. All that stuff is there. But now let me talk of advantages. I think advantages are huge as well. So one of the biggest advantages that you come with some credibility of working for, say, a particular institution. You have also had certain amount of background, so that credibility is kind of is comes with you and comes with the post, right? So that's a great take. The second is, which is no brainer, because one has worked in several countries, and also because one has alliances and friends and colleagues all over the world. One is able to link up the national experience with what's happening globally in other countries. So you kind of reflect a global light on what you see happening in the country, and hence you can take a more analytical and dispassionate position on that. So I think as an outsider, one can be more analytical and one can be more objective. So you're a bit more distant from the political drama, the domestic political drama. And the and the third is, I guess, it's not any in it's it's not any particular individual advantage, but it's really a basic agency advantage. And in this case, I will say the UN advantage, which is the convening power that you have when you come to a country, and which actually places a huge amount of responsibility as one comes as a UN civil servant in a country. There is a responsibility for forming effective alliances, for creating space for those who are not otherwise able to represent and get their voices heard, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so that's these are the three advantages, and there are many more, but yes, Pedro.
Thank you, Usha. Thank you very much. In a sense, it seems to me like you're speaking straightforward about a lot of messages that overall we have to read under the lines, a lot of non-said messages you're cherishing as the privilege of having that written down and now spoken about. Very interesting answer to the question. Another, in your memories, you describe participating on several policy processes that often take much longer than typical mandates of international civil servants. In Bangladesh, for instance, it struck me how the elaboration of a social protection policy took nearly a decade. And as you describe your experience in Cambodia and the challenge of taking over work started by colleagues before you arrived there, you used an expression that has caught my attention. You said, in a relay race, the task of the baton holder is to advance the race rather than bemoan the shortcomings of the previous runner. And in light of your experiences, what would you describe as best practices for landing into already moving processes? And what have been your own positive experiences doing the handover of agenda? And finally, how connected do you remain with projects once you're no longer officially in charge of them? I imagine, sometimes you dedicate 2, 3, 5 years of your life. So how is this time after, once you disconnect formally? Over.
Mhm. Yeah, so this is one of the challenges again of being an international civil servant, where you don't know at what point of the policy process you are coming in, right? It could be at the start, which is obviously fantastic because then you have more of control over setting the tone, or it could be just bang in the middle, or it could be towards the end. So you obviously this comes with the territory, so we are pretty much prepared for that, and that's where the system approach and the institutional approaches become very, very useful, and institutions go out of their way to ensure continuity and all those processes of handover and all that stuff is there. but but I do think that while obviously it's important to build upon what one inherits, right, and respect what one inherits rather than undermine it, w- one definitely also comes in with one's own peculiar perspective and vision. That is just the fact that one is an individual, and we however institutionalized we might become, we will not stop being our own unique selves. So I think what obviously has helped me is that whenever I land into a situation, I always ask myself, what is the big picture? And how can I make it bigger than what it already is? And what will be the pacing required for this? Is it possible to make it bigger than it is? What are the different alliances which should be there to make it bigger than it is, and then make it bigger? And also to understand what have been some of the bottlenecks that we have not been able to address. So I take that as a challenge for the program, and for myself to try and address those challenges so that we can actually improve upon where I landed and also make it much better. So it's a kind of a baton race, as you said. You obviously take the baton, and then you decide whether you run at the same pace or you slow down your pace, or you kind of run faster. And I'm always motivated to run a bit faster, but because I think I'm able to see that if I bring in more alliances, for example, when I landed in Bangladesh, We were very fortunate to work with PPRC, which Zalur was heading at that time, and he still heads it, but now he's also with BRAC. So there are ways in which we can make the baton race more effective, and that's what the book is all about, and that is probably the motivation behind writing that book. um, in terms of being in touch with the policy processes, absolutely. And writing the book is one of the ways of actually being in touch with what I worked upon. And in fact, I went back to each of these country offices and I said, hang on, where is the social protection right now? So in fact, each of the chapters end with where is the policy right now? If you, I'm sure you, and you have done a very close reading of that book, Pedro. So Bangladesh, for example, you're absolutely right. It took about a decade, and I went back because I was invited again back by UNDP and others to make a presentation on social protection. So I kept in touch, and it's like um, it's sometimes it's very exhilarating. So I have seen countries which do very well and they have progressed, but there are countries which haven't really progressed as much. Yeah, so and but overall, frankly speaking, once you're out of a country, the next country absorbs you almost entirely. So it's like you've got the new affair going on, so you've got to forget about the last one. So it's like that. So yeah, that's the honest answer.
Brilliant. That's the answer we all want. Thank you very much. And very interesting, really interesting to hear more about this, how this transition works, how institutions enable a smooth continuity, and how the heart reacts to the detachment and the ever-moving agenda of an international civil servant. Now we're running short of time, but before I hand over to the next panelist, I would like to just place one last question. And that's not simple, but again, straightforward. Could you list 3 good practices to advocate for social protections that have helped you in different contexts? And also 3 don'ts that you would highly advise an international civil servant against?
Right. Yeah, so I'll try and be as quick, rapid fire round. It seems that in 3 good practices, I would say be humble, understand the context, generate evidence. Fourth one is make alliances, especially with national counterparts, especially with national research and advocacy agencies. In terms of don'ts, I think don't come across as aggressive and arrogant and know all. Nobody likes to be preached, the least from obviously an outsider. So be don't step on political sensitivities, and do not stop reading really, because that's your bread and butter.
Brilliant, Usha. Lessons, no notes taken. And
Thanks, Pedro. Thank you so much.
I'm sure those are lessons that will have a very positive influence on a lot of our careers, mine included. Thank you a lot.
Thanks so much. Thank you,
I
Pedro.
will now handle it to Hossein, to Zilur, who will
Yes.
quickly pass it to the next panelist. Usha, thank you very much. Congratulations for your book. And colleagues watching us, please make sure you give a read. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Pedro, for being a very good interviewer. And thank you, Usha, for keeping the faith, for, in a way, the book, I see it as your act of giving, turning your experiences into wisdom for others, and being honest, actually, in your, both in the book and the answers that you gave right now to Pedro. So let's move on to some reflections on the book itself and the key insights which have come from that. One of the themes that you highlight is that theme of how crisis can be turned into opportunities. Not all can, but I think if ever there was a need for turning a crisis into opportunity, this is now, the pandemic of COVID-19. And there, the key challenge there is whether there can be shifts in the policy mindsets. And to discuss this insight, we have with us the UNICEF Regional Advisor, Mr. Abdul Alim. Uh, Floor is yours, Mr. Abdul Alim.
Thank you. Yes, let me just first begin by congratulating Usha. I think that we are all sort of authors in making, and she's taken lead on that. Um, we all wish to have some sort of a work being published or a book being published, and this is like a dream come true for Usha, and I hope that some of us will follow Usha's lead in that. And I also particularly like the title of the book, which is much more hopeful than I usually am. And Usha knows how cynical I can be. So I will just say a couple of things first on what Zilur just touched upon, which is that this is one of the best opportunities of our lifetime in terms of bringing a change in the world, not just South Asia, but in the world. Yesterday, Oxfam came out with a very interesting study which says that about $11.7 trillion worth of um, fiscal stimulus has been given. And out of that, about $9.8 trillion has happened in developed countries and only 42 billion from the non-industrialized countries. And about 2.7 billion people still have no direct household support after COVID. So we have a huge amount of issue with rising inequality. And I believe that this is the right time when politicians can actually start thinking about what is the real cost of inaction. And I think what Usha touches upon in her book, the four country experiences she has, two of these countries actually are in South Asia, Afghanistan and Nepal. And in terms of our work as social policy people, we usually tend to work much more on technical grounds, but I've become more and more convinced that we need to start looking at what one calls political analysis, and within political analysis, to look at pockets of effectiveness. Every country has in their governance structures some pockets of effectiveness, and I believe that Usha was either lucky or by sheer hard work was able to tap into those pockets of effectiveness in these four countries that she worked on. And in some cases, you could actually create those pockets of effectiveness as an international civil servant. You have some access, and it is possible to do that. But I think that certainly in South Asia, are at a very serious crossroads of our own state development. First of all, uh, in terms of my own understanding, and Zilur will perhaps back it up, Bangladesh is the only nation actually in South Asia which is a nation state, because it came into being after becoming a nation. In South Asia, we have other states that were state nations, which actually were carved out of a colonial state, and lines were drawn, and we were all handed our states. And we are still becoming a nation in those states. And part of our problem, I think, is the weak social contract that sort of beguiles our state of becoming a nation within state boundaries that were drawn and were sort of handed over to us. So Bangladesh is sort of an outlier in that sense, that it actually was a nation before it became a state. And that's partly what I believe explains Bangladesh's rise in its per capita income and very quick move on social indicators. But I think Bangladesh also still has a bit of a problem in terms of revenue to GDP ratios. And that, I think, still ails most countries in South Asia. I think the only country that sort of bucks the trend is Nepal, where Usha is working right now, where you have had a long investment in social protection measures. And I believe that there is a link between these social protection measures and what happens to the state of social contract, and therefore the revenue to GDP ratios. Now, I say this not out of thin air, but now we have a lot of evidence in what social protection does actually to improve the level of social contract. And once you have families who get direct household support from governments, there is a direct effect on the trust between citizens and the state. And I believe that in South Asia, where we have had a long cycle of what I call a vicious cycle of underinvestment, low human capital, and low revenues, there is a need to break out of that vicious cycle by doing something different and new. Now, what is new? Not entirely new, but certainly in a different way, in the sense that, yes, in South Asia, we have many countries who have had social protection programs, but in many countries, in large part, these are fragmented and targeted and conditional. And from a South Asia perspective, from UNICEF perspective, we have now been pushing for unconditional, adequate, and universal cash transfers, certainly for universal child benefits. Of course, there is a larger case we made for inclusive life cycle protection systems, but we could start with universal child benefits because that's the most important human resource that we have in South Asia. South Asian population is still very young. In most of South Asia, we still have very young populations which comprise most largest part of the populations. And so, unless we really try and create a level of trust between these growing adolescents, young children in their governing structures, we will not be able to create a virtuous cycle of high investment, high human capital, and high revenues in South Asia. And I believe that COVID provides the right opportunity for us to be able to make that mindset shift among the politicians by bringing more information, more evidence on how social protection, certainly universal child benefits, can actually help to get countries out of this rut of low investments, low human capital, and low revenues. And time is now right, and I believe that Usha's book, certainly the first part of the title, which is the land of the what is it, the blossoming land of the blossoming hope, should become actually a reality in South Asia. And I hope that many of our politicians and decision makers will find time to be able to read some of this. Usha, I would suggest that you do actually a news column on, or sort of a distillation of your experience, and try and propagate the message through other electronic media. Think something in more digestible form, because politicians would not have time to read the whole book, but certainly a para or two in terms of being able to send it out on electronic media for them to be able to see what can be done actually in such dire circumstances. I'll stop here, Zilur. I hope
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
Abdul Alim, and look forward to your book too in due course. You already have a concept to work on, pockets of effectiveness in the governance structure. So waiting for that, your book too. One other issue that Usha's analysis, the book, has highlighted is the importance of national champions. And to talk on that, I want to bring in Michael Sampson, Research Director of the Economic Policy Research Institute. Michael, floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to first congratulate Usha on this extraordinary book, which is all the more timely as we're seeing countries all around the world looking to extend and adapt and to sustain the very important social protection responses to the global pandemic that we're all facing. As you pointed out, and as the book highlights, in so many countries, to gain traction, we need champions. And that's important in times like this when we need innovation, because champions are more than anything an embodiment of courage. And Usha discusses the importance of champions in Ethiopia, in Cambodia, and in other countries. And it's a real tribute to her thesis that this idea resonates so well in so many other countries. For example, I'll move next door from Ethiopia to Kenya, because I think there's an example that illuminates some important lessons about champions in the design and implementation of Kenya's OVC cash transfer program. This is a program that's evolved to rival South Africa's child support grant in terms of its influence across the African continent. and around the world. And the point I want to make here is this wasn't about a single champion. There were many champions involved, champions in UNICEF, champions in the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, who had to take great risks against institutional barriers at a time when cash transfers were really innovative, particularly in Africa. But I want to highlight two particularly important champions there. Ahmed Hussein in the Ministry of Home Affairs, who headed the Children's Department, and the Vice President of Kenya at the time, Moody Awori, because these two champions on their own would have been highly ineffective. Ahmed Hussein could have put together a pilot, but it would have just been a beautiful model. And the Vice President could have articulated a lot of beautiful rhetoric, but it would have just been hot air. But because they were working together implicitly and explicitly, we saw real change happen. And that's because real championship requires that cooperation at the political and bureaucratic level. The political champion opens the door, the bureaucratic champion drives the program through. We saw something similar in Thailand, where a deputy prime minister interacted with a bureaucratic champion in the Department of Children and Youth. And with that long-standing background support from UNICEF that enabled the government in just 3 months to implement a child support grant. And we see that the tasks of champions can vary over time, from driving innovation to just sustaining or perhaps accelerating momentum. But we often talk a lot about champions, and we might forget who's in the opposite corner of that ring, the opponents of social protection. And the world's longest running finance minister a couple of decades ago, who retired several years ago, Trevor Manuel in South Africa, was by no means a champion of social protection. He was in fact the opponent facing South Africa's champion, Zola Skweyiya. And that process by which South Africa developed one of the most extensive social protection systems in the global South, we see an idea that links two of Usha's ideas in the book, the role of championship and the role of evidence. Because there we see that Trevor Manuel, even though he presided over a near universalization of the child support grant, never conceded to the evidence. He was a undefeated opponent of social protection. But Zola was able to use evidence ever so subtly. Zola wasn't persuaded by the evidence either. He was already convinced about the importance of social protection. Trevor wasn't convinced by the evidence. He was always opposed. But Trevor was a consummate politician. He knew how to pick his battles. And Trevor could use that, and Zola could use that evidence to influence marginal calculations. In a cabinet meeting, Zola's evidence would raise the political capital Trevor would need to win his battle, defeating an expansion of social protection. And he knew he had to use that capital in other more important battles. And that link between evidence and championship highlights a very important part of Usha's book, that sometimes the work we're doing can be too subtle and perhaps too unsatisfying because there are no clear winners or losers in this battle between champions and opponents and evidence. And I just want to read a couple sentences from Usha's book, which I think really tells this story better than any words I could write. A key lesson is that policy influencing is an unglamorous, tedious, extremely slow-moving task. One has to be committed to the long haul. The results, which impact the lives of millions of people, is worth the wait and perseverance. It is only the slow and steady that wins the race. There are simply no shortcuts. And those sentences are more important today as we grapple with COVID-19 than ever before. So I want to conclude congratulating Usha on a superb book and really encourage everybody to harness these lessons in the long haul fight we need to ensure social protection responses to this crisis are sustained. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, Sampson, both for bringing out the key insights from Usha in this regard and also adding your own great pool of wisdom in the type of champions. Just championship is a broad sort of seat. There are many occupants of that seat, the politician, the bureaucrat, even the academic perhaps, bringing a new idea onto the table, etc. And the fact that it is a long haul. Thank you for that. And finally, I want to bring in Subir Sinha, Senior Lecturer of Institutions and Development of SOAS London, on this third theme, key theme of Usha's book, which has already been alluded to Michael Sampson, is the importance of evidence, using evidence itself as a tool to drive the influencing process. Subir Sinha, over to you.
Thank you so much, Zilur, and thanks to Usha for inviting me to this panel on this important book and to Marina for organizing this event. And I'd like to say hello to my other co-panelists and to the global audience. This book's timeliness, in my view, is enhanced by events that I think the author could not have anticipated. Indeed, no one could have. I see that the book was signed off in March 2020. And at that point, who could have foreseen that within weeks of that date, the whole world would be in the grip of a deadly pandemic, with governments scrambling to prevent its spread via lockdowns, and with severe bottlenecks in the provision of social protection suddenly becoming apparent, even in countries which had made claims of great success in this in the provision of these protections. So I'd like to come back to how the pandemic has affected issues of social protection towards the end of my sort of 8 minutes, especially on questions of data and evidence. Let me preface it, though, with what I consider to be some long-standing issues in the social sciences concerning the very nature of data and evidence for policy purposes. Good policy always needs good data for the formulation of policy, for its implementation, for monitoring and course correction, and of course for evaluation. And as Usha has said in the book, however, complete knowledge is a chimera. There is never as much data as one would like, and often it is not of the quality that one would like. Data and evidence is always a snapshot, a still, if you like, of a moving image. Good data can help in the hands of deft collectors of data and deft analysts of data, not only to make good policy, but also for predictive purposes, that is to anticipate outcomes before they actually happen. But policy is made on such a snapshot, though the world to which it is responding and which it hopes to change has moved on, sometimes in ways that cannot be predicted. For example, via war or extreme weather events or pandemics, which completely might disrupt a program that is already in motion. So that's not a real problem with data and evidence per se, but really of policy itself. Now, also as a snapshot, data and evidence can only capture some, but not all relevant dimensions that should be measured. So as we know, in the past some decades, the inclusion of social sciences other than economics has obviously mitigated this to some extent. And now there is greater emphasis in collecting and compiling the voices of those who will be affected by policy. But then this also leads to a kind of a problem ultimately of being able to find patterns and to be able to generalize so that we are able to say why certain programs work in some places and they work less well or better or not at all, in other places? Who collects data and how? When is there too little data and evidence? When is it too much? When is it adequate? Who makes these decisions? And what are the obstacles? I think are all questions which everyone interested in development, but it seems to me specifically interested in social protection, given how strongly this concept undergirds so many other development initiatives, including obviously the SDGs. These are issues that we need to tackle. So let me try and answer some of these questions. One is, we are living in a hyper ideological world. Data and evidence, as we know, have long been manipulated. And, we admit that in private, if not in public, that we often take official government data with a large pinch of salt. And of course, this is with the caveat that there is a lot of variation across states in the quality and credibility of data and evidence. But when I say that we are living in a kind of a hyper ideological world, I'm referring specifically to what is being called in the social sciences the populist moment, in which strong leaders form governments on the back of large electoral mandates. And in that kind of a scenario, data and evidence are not politically innocent. Data and evidence that indicate policy failure or contradict the leader's claims to success are often attacked. Strong leaders often make big claims which are often not queried, and we don't often have the courage to ask for data and evidence because we are supposed to trust them. And this has negative consequences. The government of India, for example, announced a package of $264 billion in response to the pandemic, but now it has been found to have disbursed less than 10% of this amount. We also have had unprecedented situations, and not only in India, where the government has cast doubt on data generated by its own top data agencies. We now see, for example, governments, if they are shown to be doing badly on economic activity, to then begin to fall back on marketing survey firms and private businesses and come up with new indices, sales of motor vehicles, household appliances, and so forth. This expansion of the sources from which data and evidence is collected and in what kind of data and evidence was being collected, I think is a positive thing had it been the case that it had not taken place at the expense of delegitimizing public institutions. Data collection and reporting on numerous topics concerned directly with the core of social protection agendas is also politically risky. For example, it cannot say how many people have benefited from social safety nets in the rural employment scheme in the case of India, how many migrant workers were involved in the internationally televised exodus from the cities, how much food was provided to them, what kinds of emergency measures, and so on. In this context, underreporting, over-reporting, and in fact, outright fake news about government successes has become common in mainstream and in social media, and they've also become arenas for contestation on method and data and evidence and who can collect this kind of information and so on. In fact, just in the past week, a quite prominent social media account was suspended after it posted links to studies of malnutrition among children, in which he showed that there was a strong correlation between states ruled by the ruling party where eggs were not served in midday meals in government schools. So we now are having this conversation about social protection, SDGs, data, and evidence at a time when strong leaders have also made a strong pitch towards national sovereignty. And there is also within the population a so-called numbers fetish. Everyone wants to know the percentage of increase or decrease on one or another index of development. And to some extent, the will to power of such leaders has basically become a will to data, the construction of data that strengthens the claims of leaders rather than challenges them. And as we know, over the last decade at least, there has been considerable hostility that states have shown towards civil society and NGOs, both national and international. Coming to the end, I just wanted to sort of say, in light of the pandemic, which in a matter of months is said to have eroded decades of gains on development generally and SDGs and social protection specifically, the brittleness of success in this regard has only become too apparent in the context of COVID, though admittedly, there are also some interesting stories of institutions of lasting value created in the recent past. I do not want to say that we have only seen stories of failure. In closing, I would recommend that international agencies and international development practitioners such as Usha impress upon their counterparts in national government agencies the necessity of good quality data and the need to restore credibility in them. This might require a greater information campaign on the methodology and the research design of data collection, and greater openings for other actors from state, civil society, academia, and target groups. I'm saying this in echo of what Usha mentioned in terms of humility and the necessity to work together with others. Given the increasing centrality of social media, and I think this point has also been raised earlier, in which people across the world now access information, I would imagine that greater social media engagement, not only posting links to policy documents, but to make them visually appealing so as to be easily consumable by people with little or no academic training, must be considered. This takes matters beyond where we were a decade ago, when the effort was to embed social protection within the very logic of government. We must now push for things like universal benefits and their efficient and deep delivery, and the transparency in the collection of evidence and data, including scrutiny by civil society, media, and common citizens. With that, again, I'd like to thank Usha for publishing this very readable volume. I hope it is widely read, and I wish her all the best for her future. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Subir. And I think for bringing out the multiple angles from which this whole issue of data and policy needs to be looked at. I'll also now invite my co-chair, Sanjukta Ghosh, also to, we have now a window for Q&A from the participants. There are some questions. Sanjukta, would you like to take any here and pose one?
Yeah, I think we've picked up at least 3 questions, and I think Usha's answered some in the chat, but Usha, you're most welcome to come in and elaborate if you'd like. I think the first question was there any particular moment when you felt like giving up? If yes, what gave you the strength to keep going? And I think there's another related question to this. How much faith have you in your Almighty as well as your work? So yeah, I mean, these are 2 possibly related questions that if you wanted to answer from the personal journey and the interview you had with Pedro from that point.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Sanjukta, and thanks for those questions. There are also questions in the Q&A box. So, but just to go back to these questions, you know, at different points of life, there are different sources of inspiration. It's never one. What inspires at the age of 5 does not inspire at the age of 20, and so on and so forth. I think, you know, family and friends and some sort of faith in a higher power always helps, and I have kind of shamelessly banked on them and dipped into those sources of strength. But also what kind of keeps you going at the end of the day, despite several frustrations as an international civil servant, is the fact that you have been given a role, and it's a very privileged position. And I think it's important to appreciate that, and it's important to be aware of that, to be grateful. Um, just not in terms of, obviously it's a great job, you're taken care of and all that stuff, but the very opportunity which you are given, as I said, many are called, few are selected or chosen. That is really humbling, and I think that's what we should remember. You know, dramas of life apart, ultimately what one is there in a particular country is to do one's best, and that's what keeps us going, really. I mean, otherwise we will all grow neurotic because there are a number of frustrations in the development sector.
Thanks, Usha, on that. I saw some questions in the Q&A. Sanjukta, let me just bring out one more from that.
Yeah.
And I think I'll also ask our panelists also to chip in if they feel there's something to be said. One was the whole issue of, you know, we are talking of policy influencing, but in many of these countries, implementation is rather the critical issue. Are there commonalities there in terms of where, in a way, you might say that implementation itself is as important as the policy And therefore, transforming the implementation process itself should be the target of the influencing exercise. Usha, and then any of the panelists, if you want to chip in.
Sure, absolutely. In fact, I mentioned that a number of times in my book that, the policy design does not only happen at the design stage, but actually also happens at the implementation stage. Because if you're watching carefully what's happening at the implementation, you'll be able to see where it's going wrong. And then through whatever opportunities you have for mid-course corrections, able to feedback, so I would consider implementation very much part of the design process. And I think why it's important for us to remain open to make mistakes and to learn from implementation is because knowledge is not perfect. As Sabir was saying, evidence is not perfect. We are designing our program on the basis of certain assumptions, and these assumptions, one, could be wrong. Second, they could change because the external environment is very dynamic. So sometimes things can become dated very quickly. The political alliances and priorities might change. So it's very important that uh, we do not stick to the original design. We see what happens when the rubber hits the road. What exactly is happening. For example, if you want to implement food security program through a voucher scheme and you're supposed to capture 10 million people, what are the lessons from the supply chain? How many shopkeepers can you have, say, in the remotest part of Nepal or in India? So there are these kind of lessons you can never really foresee and kind of enlist in advance. There are the whole challenge of the development world is that it can be unpredictable, and it remains not so much explosive, but definitely dynamic. Sometimes it can be explosive, as it can be in Afghanistan, but yeah. So and every implementation context is different. So, and that's why it's all the more important for policy advisors to remain engaged in a savvy fashion when the implementation starts happening, rather than to put their feet up and say, okay, now everything is hunky dory.
Great. There was one other question. There are many aspiring Ushas waiting to tread your journey. There's a question about what is the skill set you would recommend for the next Ushas on the line?
You know what? I can say the next generation is far smarter than I am, or it's like they have got a lot of opportunities and they're very sharp and they're very aware, and hopefully they have got a much better enabling environment around them, because I think women's position in India and many other developing countries has changed since we started our journey. In terms of skill set, I think it's very important to maintain and internal integrity. That's the first thing. So what you need is character to start with, and then the skills come in. Because if the character is not there, many of the skills will not really be effective. But if your character is there, then you will tide over several frustrations and disappointments, which are bound to happen not only in international development professionals' life, but just in life in general. But to get to the more nitty gritty, I think what a reading skill to read and analyze, absolutely important, and also to communicate. Written communication is very important, as important as oral communication. But the last and the most important skill that you really need to have as a development practitioner is to be able to connect with the community, to connect with your government where you're going, to connect with your staff, really come across as if not very charming, but reasonably personable. And again, that's where humility helps you. Thank you.
Sanyukta, did you pick up any other question?
There is something that is very specific to Suvir, if we want Suvir to answer this at this point.
It was the end, yeah. But go ahead, yeah, Suvir.
Which is the question that you wanted me to answer?
Yeah, there's a particular question about how political decisions are made mostly based on political context and interest, not on evidence. And what are your experiences? most of the social protection agendas are decided by politicians without considering technical or evidential possibility. And that's the
Well,
question.
can I just answer that by reference to the notion of champions that Michael and Usha both referred to earlier on? I mean, in an ideal world, policy will be made without much political interference and entirely on logic that stems out of data and evidence. And we know that that is, impossible. Policy is inextricably linked with politics. But at the same time, you will find that around the world, as the world is at least more and more electoral, if not actually democratic, you will find that politicians will make claims that are quite compatible and promises which are quite compatible with social protection and, in fact, with sustainable development goals, even if they don't actually go through with that. So everyone says that they have reduced hunger. Everyone wants to reduce poverty. Everyone wants to create more jobs. Everyone wants to have better environmental protection. Everyone wants to create gender equity and women's empowerment. These are almost non-controversial as far, I mean, there are very few politicians who can get to power saying the opposite. I would like to give you fewer jobs or by creating a worse environment and so on. So there is that despite the fact that politics determines policy rather than the other way around, a lot of the things that are being seen as desirable in things like the SDGs have now become mainstream political discourse and ways in which people can evaluate the performance of government. Now that leads to a couple of interesting problems. That gives incentives, therefore, for politicians to also fake the data because they do not want to be seen as having fallen short on the claims that they have made. But also, secondly, what is interesting there is that over time, there have been champions in, for example, the bureaucracy. I mean, one can't really think of the local village community or community-based natural resource development in countries like India without there being from time to time people like NC Saxena or other bureaucrats who was in the late 1980s, early 1990s, not just a senior member of the Indian bureaucracy, but someone who connected the Indian bureaucracy with the British academia and the World Bank and the USAID and so on. So I think you've got to think of that in two different ways. One is, what are the political opportunities given to people interested in development by the rhetoric and the political agendas of parties themselves? So then someone like Usha can say to them when she goes to meet them, it is already in your manifesto, and we are trying to help you achieve what you have already set out in your manifesto. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, Zildur, you
Right.
probably.
Yeah, Sanjukta, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I think there are some specific questions on the UN, on the working and the functioning of the UN agencies from Leslie, which says, do political considerations and national personal rivalries get in the way sometimes or to a degree for UN agencies working as effectively as they might, just as the UN has been stymied by big power vetoes in the Security Council? Your experience of these difficulties or challenges? And I think there is another question that kind of complements this, is that due to the decline in international solidarity, though it was never great, are you pessimistic for the future of the effectiveness of UN agencies? How much more in terms of money do UN agencies need? And were you shocked at how poorly financed the COVAX initiative will be? So those are very two distinct points on the functioning of UN agencies. Right. You have any thoughts on that, Usha?
I thought I'll give it a shot and then perhaps invite others also to chip in because they could be perhaps a bit more objective than I can be. I guess absolutely. I guess political considerations definitely weigh in, and I don't think we have to look far. South Asia happens to be a very, very politically contested space. Um, um, I mean, just as a civil servant, just as a UN staffer, there are, as I was saying earlier, one of the disadvantages is that you perhaps cannot be as vocal as, say, a national NGO, right? because you'll be stepping on sensibilities, and you're there at the not so much mercy, but definitely at the goodwill of the host government. So that given, what really helps my kind of work is that we are in an apolitical agency. So I'm in UNICEF. Before that, I was at World Food Program. So our job is really humanitarian and development. And what are the principles of humanitarian and even development is non-partisanship and inclusion. So we try and stick to that, and we are very lucky that we are working with children who everybody loves. So our agenda is much more easily acceptable. I'm not in the political arm of the UN. But yes, certainly the politics, international politics, international political dimensions definitely impede and limit and set the contours of what UN can achieve, especially within its areas like peace building and disarmament and other things. In terms of the relevance of the UN, in fact, what I see is that the current pandemic has actually emphasized the relevance of the UN, right? The COVAX initiative, I think, is a fantastic initiative, especially for countries like Nepal and other developing countries which do not have so much of resources to buy all the stocks that they need themselves. So the COVAX has come around. It's not sufficiently resourced yet, and I just hope that there will be more funds coming in. But for Nepal, a good percentage of population will be getting money through COVAX, and it actually, the technical knowledge that WHO brings in and UNICEF brings in, whether it is around the risk behaviors and the capacity to kind of disseminate those messages and that information across the country is tremendous. And just the opposite has happened, whether it is by international advocacy, for example, rights of migrants that IOM has picked up, or whether it is food security. And I think no surprises that WFP won the Nobel Peace Prize precisely because they were able to stem off starvation and hunger in the context of COVID. So you need global actors because many of these challenges are global. Because the world has become a small, hyper interconnected village where you need somebody who can kind of bring different actors together. What I definitely want to see more and more of this convening power being exercised by the UN. I would like to see the UN, for example, to reach across more strongly and effectively to the private sector, to the academia, to the national research agencies, and be more bold than what it is, really. I mean, it can do much more than what it is able to do, even with all the limitations of political sensitivities and considerations.
Thank you, Usha. We are in the, I think, last 10 minutes. I'll invite my co-chair, Sanyukta, to make some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Zildur. I was hoping you were going to do that first, but yeah, I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion, and thank you, Usha, again. Once again, congratulations for the book and the extremely interesting and exciting pointers. I must sort of mention here that, being a historian of indigenous knowledge and agricultural knowledge, and while I was reading the book, my first thoughts were, it kind of resonates with many of the accounts of civil servants that you find writing about their own regions, historical accounts. And then I find there's a lot of discussion, obviously, of the technical sides, which you don't find in the historical accounts so much. But there's a lot of skepticism around, how your own, and there's a lot of self-reflection in the book as well. Which I think touches on many of the points that were raised in the discussions as well. For instance, Alim has talked a lot about mindset shifts around crisis, and that the fact that government structures and political effectiveness is something that is aligned to serious state developments. And I just feel that Ethiopia in your book provides a good contrasting example as to how you're not really talking about the colonial setup there, but how non-colonial, not colonial forces, but more kind of indigenous forces are at work in that particular country context. And those, again, have a different impact on implementation strategies. But I think the point about, how COVID and crisis is a large context in which we should be mapping at mindset shifts is something that you also bring out in your book in various ways, particularly when you talk about universal cash transfers, universal child benefits, and how levels of trust and hope, you kind of constantly build on that, are those kind of empowering virtuous cycle as Alim has pointed out in his reflection. For Michael, again, Michael Sampson, really he ties with the counter strategic developments that come out with reflections on the various champions. There are many champions, as he said, it's not just the UN, but you're working in cooperation with various other links. And therefore, those links, again, are tied up with how evidence is built with regard to champions. And that also puts a spin on how development should be paced. And, you also mention of the pace of development quite a lot in your work, but there's a lot of waiting, there's a lot of slow moving things, reflecting on the particular ecosystems and the socioeconomic conditions that you labor quite a lot on every example you give. What strikes me here in this context of slow moving is the contrast of knowledge as well, where you talk about a body of knowledge, which I think at the start of your journey, you mentioned you're a middle-class girl, you're kind of made to believe, or you've achieved something. And therefore there's some kind of an upper, I don't know, when you enter a country, you kind of think you know it all, but having lived through that experience of serving in different countries, you've gradually learned that it's not really a top-down approach that you should be taking, but a more bottoms-up approach. And that ties in very well with how evidence currently should be looked at, who should be questioning evidence. The transparency issue is definitely something that is going to crop up with the integration of technology, particularly with development issues. And I think there's a lot of, you also talk about the influencing of the various exercises between people. So not just the UN top level agencies, financial directorates or finance ministries, but how you also have to deal with the humdrum entities, as you call it, like a project team or others who are working. And those people are constantly in dialogue as to what works. So the pragmatic side, the policy side is going to be not just evidence, but I think the continuous importance of these humdrum entities in various contexts of development is just as important. So I think I've kind of touched with the whole civil society issues that Severe mentioned and the transformations around that with evidence building as to what is evidence, the transparency of evidence in the social media, as well as those humdrum entities that are going to work with these different kinds of evidence, which will put you in a different position as to how technology is now working with development paradigms and policymaking. That's another take, and I think probably ask for another volume from you. I'll stop there, Zilur. I think I've mentioned.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanjukta. So we're on the very last minutes. So for Usha, I think obviously the book is there for us to read and to draw out more insights than has been discussed in this 1.5 hours. But I think two bigger messages coming out from Usha and from all the discussion. One is the need to be bold. The moment demands it. The world demands it, actually. In fact, it's a moral imperative to be bold, because the crisis is of a different nature, different level. We have to be bold. And boldness is in terms of, I think, what I take from Usha's, the book itself, but having known her also for quite a while, is pushing the boundaries, getting the appropriate, enhancing the efforts. It's not a, as Michael Sampson also mentioned, it's not a dramatic win overnight. It's a long haul. You have to persevere. And I think that is very, very important. So we need both this desire to be bolder. And then, of course, we also need the analytical sort of skills, looking at the process. I think the key takeaway for me from Usha's book is really to unpack the word policy. Policy as priority, policy as process, policy as even as outcome, actually, looking at all those levels. So I think policy with a big P, but policy also with a small p. Both are equally relevant if you're to get the outcomes we want. And I think in terms of some concluding remarks, I was struck by the word Michael Sampson mentioned, who is in the other side of the ring. We are all motivated here to bring about good changes in the world. Who is in the other side of the ring? And I think I would like to unpack that opponent also. There may be opponents who are simply ideologically in a different terrain, perhaps. But I think not enough academic attention has been given to unpack the personality of the political decision maker. We often think of, there are of course the interested and willing decision maker. They need good data and good advice. But these type of decision maker, actually in our experience, we see that they're few and far between. The more common, and then at the other end, you have the ideological opponent who are basically opposed to the whole idea of perhaps, even if they don't say it in those terms, as I think Subesina did say, there are some feel-good goals everyone ascribes to, actually. But nevertheless, you have in priority, you have real opponents there. But in between, there is a large terrain occupied by uninterested policymakers, but not necessarily ideologically opposed. We have to ignite their interest. And I think the challenge for those who want to influence is there is that challenge also. How do you ignite the interest of policymakers who are not yet perhaps aware of the need to engage on this? This uninterested policymaker is to my mind, in my experience, I see they are numerically the much bigger crowd, actually. And how we can, and there I find the importance of, I'm sure, it may, from your experience, you may also see it. It's also very important of how you package, not data itself, but how is it being packaged? In the context of Bangladesh, I just want to give one example. We did quick 2 rounds of surveys to get government interested in some higher level social protection. And we found that, yes, there is the traditional poor, 20.5% by government's own estimates. But then there is this large crowd who has fallen newly into poverty. And we coined a term for media and political leader consumption. We coined the term new poor. And it seemed to have gained currency through the media and into the political decision-making process. These are the people who are not poor, but have fallen into poverty, lower urban middle class, etc., etc. And their number, we calculated the number was about another 21%, which is nearly 30 million in the context of Bangladesh. And it did evoke a response from the government. They quickly mobilized about nearly $150 million rollout, though eventually, as Subir, I think, mentioned also for the Indian context, they didn't eventually get to disburse all their amount because of implementation. They didn't think through the implementation challenges there. So I think packaging is also a very important issue related to the whole issue of influencing. I would really really emphasize on that. And at the end of the day, I think Usha's insights, the perspectives for influencing, how to influence, there is, I think, Michael Sampson also elaborated on the political decision maker, the bureaucratic decision maker perspectives, and bureaucracy also can be the sitting in the ministry, it can be sitting also in the district administration. Like a listing of the beneficiaries. That's a district administration type of job where the solutions are to be found there, actually, not in the sitting in the ministries. So I think that is also a important issue. And I would end by saying, of course, there is the whole challenge of walking the talk. I mean, there is the feel good. And I find often that we also, I would appeal to Usha to, in your next book, do keep this in mind, that us as advocates or as trying to influence, there is a very comfortable zone about policy influencing, where it's all a hall of mirrors. It's all good words, getting paper policies onto the table, even program, even budget allocation, but no actual, very poor outcomes on the ground. The walking the talk doesn't happen in many of these cases. I think Subir Sinha highlighted the problem, particularly for India, and it's also the case in the context of Bangladesh. So I think we have to be, as advocates, we really cannot get ensnared, I think if that's the word to be used here, in this feel-good hall of mirrors type of thing, where the ideas are good, the program articulation is good, even the design at one level is good, but outcomes are rather not inadequate. So I think we need to be aware. And I think the COVID-19 for the social protection agenda, and particularly in South Asia, it has triggered, and I foresee, I don't know in Africa whether this has happened, I foresee that this is going to get traction down the line, is that social protection will now have to be brought to the cities in a much bigger way. Social protection has primarily been with reference to the rural population. I think COVID-19 has dramatically exposed the vulnerability of the urban poor. And for the policymakers of South Asia, we have been accustomed to think of the urban poor as a problem, and the solution was let's send them to the villages. But I think now we really have seen that this is a group whose problems have to be addressed. And I also already see movements in that direction. So let me not take up any more time. Congratulate Usha. Look forward to the other books coming down the line from Usha herself. The panelists, of course, many of them are already many books, and the new Ushas in the making who are waiting to be inspired by this book. And at the end of the day, I think we need to keep the faith, and it is, I would really end on that note. All this will make a difference if we really wake up to the moral imperative of the moment, that it is a crisis where we cannot hide behind any curtains. The crisis is there and we have to solve it. On that note, I will, with the permission of the organizers, end the webinar here. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so
Thank you very
much.
much.
Thank you much.
Thank you to all our organizers.
Thanks so much, Sanjukta and Zulu. Thanks all the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations again, Usha. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
Bye, Usha. Thank you. very
Bye,
much.
Sanjukta. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye, Subir.
Sanjukta, Michael, Subir, everyone. Thank you. Usha.